My name is Claire Reynolds, and I am 33 years old. Just 3 days before Christmas, I came home from an exhausting 12-hour night shift at the hospital and found my entire life stacked on my parents' front porch. It was packed into 9 black trash bags, tied off neatly with the same rabbit ear knots my mother uses on bread bags. And shining on the front door was a brand new brass deadbolt. I am an ICU nurse. I had spent the last 2 years living under that roof, taking care of my dad around the clock after his massive stroke, and my family just locked me out, the way you would cancel a cheap magazine subscription. That morning, standing in the snow in my scrubs, I still foolishly believed it was a misunderstanding. But by Christmas Eve, I was signing my name onto a cot in a homeless shelter just 4 blocks from the church where I grew up. And what a total stranger whispered to me on the cot next to mine that night. Cracked my family's perfect story straight down the middle. What I chose to do with that secret. Well, none of them saw that coming. Welcome back to the channel where women who carried everyone else's burdens finally learn how to set them down. These are stories told slowly and calmly, the way you'd tell a friend over a cup of coffee. If this story hits close to home for you, drop a comment below and be sure to subscribe. Let me take you back to that freezing porch, 3 days before Christmas, while the coffee in my thermos was still warm. I stood there and counted the bags. 9 of them. 33 years of my life folded into cheap plastic. I rang the bell of the house I had been paying the utility bills on for 2 whole years. The door opened just 4 inches, stopped by a heavy chain. My mom, Helen, looked at me through the gap like I was a stranger selling vacuums. She didn't look sad. She looked entirely composed. She told me that the house was sold. She said the buyers were closing in early January and that it was time for everyone to stand on their own 2 feet. I asked her to repeat that slower. I had been awake since 4:00 p.m. the previous day, and I thought the exhaustion was messing with my hearing. But she didn't say it slower. She said it colder. Through the crack in the door, down the hallway, I could see the shape of my dad in his recliner by the window. I could see the metal outline of his walker. He didn't even turn his head. "Mom, it is December 22nd, I whispered, my voice instinctively shifting into the calm, level tone I use with panicking families in the ICU. "I gave you my paychecks." She looked at me through that 4-inch gap and delivered the sentence she had been practicing my whole life. "In this family, Claire, love is earned." Then the door clicked shut, soft as a pill bottle. I stood there as the snow started catching on my black trash bags. The strangest thought floated into my head. She didn't even sound angry. You don't get angry at a subscription. You just cancel it. What I didn't know yet was why the house had to sell so incredibly fast, and exactly whose pocket that money was promised to. Let me back up 2 years, so you can understand how a fully employed registered nurse ends up locked out of her childhood home in the dead of winter. When my dad had his stroke, I was renting a beautiful 1-bedroom apartment across town. Mom called me from the hospital hallway, crying that careful, calculated cry she has, and begged, "Claire, we need you, just for a few months." So I did what daughters like me are trained to do. I broke my lease, cut my hospital hours back so I could manage his physical therapy schedule, and moved back into my old childhood bedroom. Mom set up what she called a household account. It was a joint bank account in both our names. "You work long night shifts, honey," she said sweetly. "Let me handle paying the bills so nothing lapses." Every month, my direct deposit went in. About $2,300. His stroke medication, the mortgage, the electric bill, her weekly salon appointments, it all swam in the same pond. And I was the only one filling it. I want to be clear, I wasn't entirely blind. In November, I checked the bank statement and found a random $9,000 transfer out of the household account and into a private savings account with only her name on it. I confronted her at the kitchen table. She slid a thick folder of pharmacy receipts across the table like a defense attorney resting her case. "Insurance doesn't cover everything, Claire," she said. "Do you want your father to go without his medication?" I changed my direct deposit back to my personal account that exact week, but the 2 years of money that was already in the pond, Legally, that was considered a gift. $55,000 of my life savings, gone. Around that time, a silver SUV started parking outside our house on Tuesday afternoons. A man in a suit walked our fence line taking photos. When I asked Mom about it, she didn't even blink. "It's a reappraisal for the homeowner's insurance," she lied smoothly. There was never a "for sale" sign in the yard. She sold it quietly, off-market, through a realtor friend from her church. Because signs invite questions, and my mother has never once in her life invited a question. So, do the math with me as I stood on that porch on December 22nd. My personal checking account held exactly $1,140. My old Honda Civic had started slipping gears the week prior, and the mechanic wanted $2,000 to rebuild a transmission on a car that was barely worth $1,000. Every apartment complex in town required first month, last month, a security deposit, and proof of income 3 times the rent. My proof of income looked like a woman who had spent 2 years working part-time to fund her mother's secret bank account. The Pinecrest Motel on Highway 9 cost $85 a night. I sat in my dying car in their snowy parking lot and rationed out my own survival the way I ration IV fluids for a patient. 2 nights, I decided. I could afford 2 nights to figure this out. That afternoon, I made a phone call I swore I would never make. I called the police on my own parents. The officer who met me at the motel was young and polite, but entirely useless. "You lived there for 2 years, ma'am. Then you are legally a tenant. A lockout like that is illegal, but it's a civil matter." A civil matter. I came to hate that phrase. He couldn't drag my mother out in handcuffs for changing a deadbolt. I would have to file papers in court, which wouldn't even open until after the new year. People always ask me in the comments, "Why didn't you just break a window or kick the door down?" Because my father was behind that door. Half of his body was paralyzed. If I came crashing through that door with the police, it would happen right in front of him. I had spent 10 years keeping other people's worst days calm in the ICU. I was not going to hand my father one of his. So I did the thing that still amazes me to this day. I waited politely. Like a good girl, while the water rose over my head. Checkout at the Pinecrest Motel was 11:00 a.m. on December 24th. I stood at the front desk while the manager apologized to the floor. A pipe had burst in the east wing overnight. Half the rooms were flooded, and the rest were taken by stranded holiday travelers. He couldn't extend my stay. The next closest motel was 8 miles up the interstate, and my car's transmission had died completely the night before. The buses in our town stopped running at 6:00 p.m. on Christmas Eve. I sat in my freezing, dead car behind a strip mall wearing 3 layers of scrubs, doing survival math in a spiral notebook. I washed my hair in a gas station bathroom sink and told the cashier I was on a winter camping trip. He believed me, or he was kind enough to pretend. By 4:00 p.m., an Arctic weather front rolled in. Wind chill advisories hit the radio. Single digits overnight. I was walking down Maple Street when I saw a paper sign taped inside the dark window of Grace Community Church. Hand-lettered in red marker, Warming Center. Open tonight. All welcome. Even me. By 8:00 p.m., it was 8 degrees outside, and the wind felt like it had a personal grudge against me. I stood across the street from the church hall for longer than I will ever admit. Through the amber-glowing windows, I could see folding tables, coffee pots, and a woman in a Santa hat handing out blankets. I had a nursing license in good standing. I had a retirement account that I couldn't touch for weeks without penalties. I had a family living just 2 miles away with a Christmas wreath hanging on their brand-new deadbolt. And I stood in the freezing wind, negotiating with my own pride. There is a specific kind of pride that gets women like me killed. I took a deep breath, crossed the street, and pulled the heavy wooden door open. Inside, it smelled like wet wool, cheap coffee, and cinnamon. A man with a clipboard smiled at me without a single flicker of judgment and asked for my name. They gave me cot, number 14, against the east wall. The hall held about 30 of us that night. An old man with a cough that I immediately diagnosed as bronchitis. A young mother with 2 toddlers. I lasted about 20 minutes sitting on my cot before I saw a volunteer struggling to bandage a woman's bleeding heel. 10 years of hospital habit took over. My legs just stood up and went. I dressed the blister properly. I checked 2 blood pressures. I convinced the coughing man to promise me he'd visit the free clinic on Friday. It helped, not them. It helped me. Being useful is my resting heart rate. I went back to cot 14. A woman settled onto the cot next to mine, holding 2 paper cups of hot cocoa. She handed one to me like we had been friends for 30 years. She had silver hair tied in a long braid, reading glasses on a beaded chain, and incredibly sharp, steady eyes. She looked like the kind of woman who runs a church bake sale with military precision. She watched me for a moment, then asked the question that broke my entire life open. "What is your name, honey?" "Claire," I said softly. "Claire Reynolds." I watched the name hit her physically. She set her cocoa down on the floor, slow and deliberate, like it was a bomb. Both of her hands came up to cover her mouth. A gasp escaped her chest like it had been trapped there for 2 decades. I went through the medical checklist in my head. Stroke, sugar crash, shock. She shook her head as if she could hear me diagnosing her. "Reynolds," she whispered. "Was your grandmother's name Margaret? Margaret Reynolds off Elm Street?" A chill ran down my spine. My grandmother had been dead for 20 years, and nobody in my family ever brought her up. Grandma Margaret was a closed file, a difficult woman, a story my parents erased. I nodded. Yes, Margaret was my grandmother. The woman reached out and took my hand. Hers were shaking. "Honey," she said, tears pooling in her eyes. "My name is Sarah Higgins, and I have been looking for you for 20 years. If you have ever been the person your family calls first for help but remembers to thank last, tell me in the comments where you are listening from tonight. Because what Sarah Higgins told me on that cot is the reason you are hearing this story at all." She said, "Your grandmother hired me before she died. She left you something. But there was a strict condition to get it. And sweetheart, you just met the condition." I didn't believe her. I've seen enough hospital con artists to know how this sounds. A stranger at a homeless shelter magically knows my dead relative and promises me an inheritance. So I asked her sharp, clinical questions. Sarah answered every single one without hesitating. She knew my middle name. She knew about the burn scar on my grandmother's left wrist from an oven rack in 1990. She even pulled out her phone and showed me a photo of a photo. Me at 11 years old, missing a front tooth, standing in front of my grandmother's tomato garden holding a green colander. Sarah explained that she was a retired private investigator from Philadelphia. In the winter of 2004, a small, straight-backed woman walked into her office, slapped a folder on her desk, and said she needed someone patient. "I wasn't looking for where you were," Sarah explained as the shelter lights dimmed. "I always knew where you were. I was waiting for the day you would finally need me." My grandmother had paid her a massive retainer with a bizarre instruction. "Watch my granddaughter. Once a year is enough. You will know the exact day when it arrives." When Sarah had asked how she would know, my grandmother had said, "The day will look like this. My son and his wife will be entirely done with her. She will be standing outside their door, locked out with nothing left in her hands. It will probably be winter." I sat on the cot, my cocoa turning cold. Everything in me that was still a loyal daughter tried to defend my parents. "They aren't bad people," I stammered. "My dad's stroke, the hospital bills. You don't understand the pressure my mom is under." Sarah nodded with a face that had heard 1,000 lies. "Margaret used to defend them in that exact same voice," she said gently. Then she leaned forward and delivered the sentence that changed my life. "Margaret knew they would do this to you, Claire. That is why I am here." On Christmas morning, the shelter served stale pancakes. Sarah took me to the only open diner in town, ordered us both coffee, and pulled a bundle out of her tote bag. It was a brick of envelopes, tied tightly with garden twine. There were 74 envelopes. Every single one was addressed in my grandmother's beautiful, cursive handwriting, addressed to me. And across the face of every single envelope written in thick black ink, was the exact same verdict: return to sender. It was my mother's handwriting, that slanted, perfect cursive that signed my school permission slips, 74 times. My mother had taken an old woman's love and sent it back like garbage. In my family, the story of Grandma Margaret was exactly 3 sentences long. She got difficult after Grandpa died. She got confused. She abandoned the family, and it broke your father's heart. Nobody who is confused writes 2 letters a month for 3 years. The woman I was told abandoned us had written to me 74 times while I lived just 3 miles away, being told she didn't want to see me. If Grandma left me something, I asked, my voice shaking with anger, why on earth would she make me lose everything and end up in a homeless shelter before I could have it? What kind of love is that? Sarah stirred her coffee slowly. She told me, do not give it to her while she lives under their roof. Give it to her the day she has nothing, because if you give it to her before that day, they will take it from her and she will let them. I opened my mouth to argue, but I closed it. If I had inherited money at 25, my mother would have called a family meeting. She would have said it was selfish to keep a windfall when the roof needed repairs. And I, the good little nurse, would have poured it right into their pond. My grandmother hadn't set a cruel condition. She had written a flawless prescription. Do not administer the cure until the patient is strong enough to keep it down. The next morning, Sarah took me to a small law office above the local bank to meet Robert Harrison, a semi-retired attorney. He slid a file across the desk. The Margaret Reynolds Trust, dated 2004. Inside was a deed to a lake cottage on Blackwood Lake, 40 minutes north of town. My grandmother had bought it in 1978 and titled it so quietly that her own son never knew it existed. She had also left an account with $85,000, instructing the lawyer to pay the property taxes and insurance for as long as the money lasted. 20 years of taxes had eaten the account down to $23,600. She was very clear that it wasn't supposed to be a fortune, the lawyer said. Fortunes get greedy families involved. Then he handed me a small envelope. Inside was a single brass house key threaded onto a loop of soft, red-checkered kitchen string. My breath caught in my throat. I knew that string. It was from the curtains in her old kitchen. Sarah drove me up to Blackwood Lake that afternoon. The cottage sat back from the frozen water behind 2 massive maple trees. Small, white clapboard, green door. The brass key turned perfectly. Inside, it was freezing, but it had the clean, quiet smell of a room nobody had lied in for 20 years. Her quilt was still folded over the rocking chair. On the kitchen table, sitting right in the center, was one final letter. I read it in my winter coat. My grandmother told me everything without a drop of self-pity. After Grandpa died, my parents began to manage her. First, they took her car keys, then her checkbook. Then they tried to put her in a cheap home to take her house. She sold the house herself before they could trap her, and their revenge was cutting her off from the only thing she loved, me. At the bottom of the letter, she wrote, I can rest peacefully knowing you were never their debt, Claire. You were the girl. I stayed at the cottage. I bought a used Honda Civic from Sarah's grandson for $1,200 and picked up nursing shifts at the county hospital. I told nobody in my family where I was. I just wanted one place on earth with no arithmetic in it. I got exactly 9 days of peace. In a small town, secrets don't last. A woman at the hardware store recognized me, and the church gossip mill did the rest. On January 3rd, my phone rang. Mom. I answered it. Her voice was warm, melted butter. Sweetheart, she sang. Christmas got completely out of hand. Everyone was under so much stress. Come home, honey, we are family. I listened to her, doing my mental translation exercise. It took exactly 90 seconds for her to drop the act. And when you come home, she added smoothly, we can sit down and talk about the lake place as a family. There it was. Mom, I asked quietly, whose name was on the deed of the house you just sold? The line went dead silent. We'll talk soon. Love you, she snapped and hung up. She hadn't even asked where I slept on Christmas Eve. My cousin Mia called me a few days later and gave me the missing puzzle piece. My parents hadn't sold the house because they wanted to downsize. They sold it because of math. 2 years of Dad's medical copays, maxed out credit cards, and a secret home equity loan had ruined them. After the debts were paid, there was almost nothing left from the house sale. They were currently renting a cheap, cramped condo by the highway. Aunt Helen has been telling everyone at church that you inherited secret millions from Grandma Margaret, Mia said softly. She says you're being selfish. I finally saw the whole machine. I hadn't been kicked out in a fit of cruelty. I had been liquidated. An asset that stopped producing cash, cleared off the books before the move. A week later, an expensive envelope arrived in my mailbox. A dinner invitation. New Year family dinner. Aunt Diane's house. Saturday at 6:00. Please come. We want a fresh start. I knew it was an ambush. A boardroom meeting disguised as a family dinner. I went anyway, but I didn't bring my checkbook. I brought a cherry pie, baked using my grandmother's recipe from the cottage. When I walked into Aunt Diane's house, the entire family was seated in the living room. Nobody was laughing. It looked like a courtroom. They played nice for 20 minutes. Then, my mother set her coffee down with a sharp click that called the room to order. She pulled out printed pages from Zillow, a market analysis for lakefront property on Blackwood Lake, with a suggested listing price highlighted in bright yellow. Your father needs 24-hour care, Claire, she said in her reasonable, manipulative voice. That lake place is just sitting there empty. Margaret would have wanted it to take care of family. We sell it, we pay for your father's care, and everything goes back to normal. Around the room, my aunts and uncles were nodding in agreement. What exactly does normal mean, Mom? I asked. She smiled like I had finally understood. You move into the condo with us. You help with Daddy. You're the nurse. In this family, love is earned, Claire. Your father earned yours the day you were born. I set my fork down. The tiny clink echoed in the silent room. I looked at her, using my absolute coldest ICU voice. No. I told them I would not be selling my grandmother's house. Not tonight, not ever. Then I laid out my counteroffer. I pulled out a folder with 3 elite stroke care facilities I had toured. I named Oakwood Care Center, which had an open bed. I told them I had already drafted his Medicaid waiver. I will be his care coordinator for free forever, I said. Every doctor's appointment, every medication review. You get my medical expertise for the rest of his life, but the house stays mine. My mother went pale, then forced tears into her eyes in a single, practiced motion. Aunt Diane actually stood up and yelled, "After everything your mother has sacrificed for you." I stood up, grabbed my coat, and looked my mother dead in the eyes. You taught me that love is earned in this family, Mom. Well, I'm done earning it. I am going to love him for free from my own front door, and you have never once seen what that looks like. Watch me. I walked out and left the pie on the table. The next month, my father suffered a second, massive stroke. When I walked into the hospital's neuro ICU at midnight, my mother was in the waiting room. She wasn't looking at me with relief. I know what fear looks like in a wife's eyes. This wasn't fear. She was looking at me like an asset that had just walked back into range. At the discharge planning meeting the next morning, my mother tried to trap me one last time in front of the hospital's social worker. My daughter is a brilliant nurse, my mother told the social worker, gesturing to me. She has a large, empty house on Blackwood Lake. He will move in with her. Everyone knows family care is better than a facility. The social worker looked at me. My mother smiled her sweetest, most toxic smile. You're the nurse, Claire. This is what you're for. I didn't yell. I turned to the social worker and spoke in cold, load-bearing clinical terms. I do not consent to being the discharge plan. A single RN working shifts cannot safely provide 24-hour stroke care in a private home. It is dangerous for the patient. The social worker stopped typing. I turned back to my mother. I toured Oakwood Care Center. They have a bed. I will be his medical advocate on every chart. What you don't get is my house, my money, or my silence. Not anymore. My mother stood up slowly. She gathered her purse and her printed Zillow pages. She looked down at me and handed down the final verdict of her religion. Then you have no family. She walked out of the room. The social worker, sliding a form across the table to me, asked softly, "The county needs a single point of contact for his medical decisions. Who should I list?" I wrote my name, my number, and checked the box that said daughter. My dad moved into the Oakwood facility in February. He has a window bed that faces a bird feeder. I am there every Tuesday. I bring coffee for the nurses, and I read my grandmother's returned letters out loud to him. He can't speak much anymore, but when I read the letters, his good hand grips mine tight. He knew. He always knew what she was doing. He just let it happen. His grip tells me he is sorry. My mother visits him on Sundays. The nursing staff figured out the hostile dynamic within a month, ensuring we never cross paths. She tells the church that I am a greedy daughter who chose a dead woman's house over her own blood. I let her tell her stories. Her ledger is the only language she knows. I went back to the lake house. The brass key hangs on a nail by the front door now. It did its job. Here is what my grandmother knew, and what I hope you take away from this story tonight. Any love that hands you a bill at the end of the day is not love. It is rent. The people who truly love you will leave the door unlocked, leave the key on a string, and never once send you the invoice. If you are the one quietly holding your toxic family together, hear me. Setting a boundary is not a betrayal. You are allowed to love them from the safety of your own front door. If this story kept you company today, subscribe to the Last Chapter Stories. Tell me in the comments what you would have done standing on that freezing porch with your life in trash bags. Stay close. There is always room by this fire for you.